Yo, yo, yo. How you doing today, everyone? Wazoo here, and this is another episode of Wazoo Web Bytes. Yeah, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at Spring Boot 3.1.0, which adds support for Docker Compose right into our Spring Boot server. Yeah, I think this is going to be really cool, really fun. It'll really help you streamline how you're developing Spring Boot applications locally using Docker. So let's get started. All right. So we're on the Docker website right now. If you've never used Docker before, it's a way of creating containers that you can run different services in on either your machine or machines that you put up in the cloud. It's essentially a kind of a souped up version of VMs, if you remember working with VMs back in the day, or maybe you use VMs today. A similar concept, just using images that are maintained by the open source and Docker communities, and allows you to really create independent environments locally, which really help when you're working with specific versions of software, for example. So you can't just have generic Postgres or MySQL running locally when you're needing a specific version. This is a way of creating that for you. Okay, so let's start off at start.spring.io as we normally do when creating a Spring Boot project. And we're going to be creating a Maven project, choosing Java, and make sure to select 3.1.0 or higher, whatever the current release is when you're viewing this video. And let's see, for an artifact, we'll just create a name like Spring Boot Docker Compose Demo. Something really explicit like that, yeah. And we'll be using a jar file, and we'll keep it at Java 17. And for dependencies, what we are going to be adding is Lombok, Spring Web, Spring Data, JPA. And for database, we're going to be using Maria. So we're going to be creating containers locally for our database, as well as PHPMyAdmin, which is a really great and lightweight GUI interface for taking a look at your local database. Okay, so I think that's everything. And yeah, that's good. So just go ahead and hit the generate button and download and extract the zip wherever you work with files on your machine. Okay, and as you can see, I've opened up the project in Visual Studio Code. I think it might be easier to showcase what's going on with Docker and Spring Boot in Visual Studio Code with the help of their extensions. So I'm using a Docker extension as well as the Spring Boot dashboard extension. So you'll notice when I click on the Docker one that I don't have anything running. It's having trouble connecting to it because I've purposely left the Docker service off just to show what happens when we first start things up. Okay, so let's go back into our project here. And what we are going to do is create just a very simple single table. We'll create a table called product, and just a sample product that we might have in some kind of shopping or e-commerce application. We'll create a repository interface for it and a simple web service call to just retrieve all of the products that we'll have in the database. And then from there, we'll create a Docker Compose file and do all that lovely Docker magic for us. And we'll take things from there. Okay. So in our main folder, we'll drill down into our Java com example. Oh, let's open this up a little more. Spring Boot Docker Compose demo. Okay, maybe we don't need it quite so big. Let's create a new folder, and we'll just call it models. And we'll just create a product.java. Okay, so it is a product, and we'll create a entity, and we'll use the entity and data annotations from Lombok, and then we'll create an all args constructor annotation, and the no args constructor annotation. Okay, we'll go into product here. We'll use the @id annotation and the @generated value annotation. So that way, when Spring Boot starts things up, Hibernate will wire things up and create a proper SQL sequence for our product model, as I will shortly show you when we get things up and running. So this will just be a long, and then let's go ahead and let's create a few fake fields here. Maybe for a product, we have a name, and then we have a description, and then some kind of price. Cool. That's really all I want to do. So let's go ahead and resolve these. Okay, so that's all we're going to add for our model. Like I said, really short, really basic. And let's go ahead and create a repository interface for it. So back in our main folder, let's create a new folder called repositories. And let's create a new interface called product repository. And we'll use an interface here. And again, this is just a small, we're going to be extending the list CRUD repository interface. And we're going to be passing in creating it of a type product and a long hash map. Okay, so that all looks good. Here. Maybe that's easier to see. Okay, so like I said, really short and sweet repository interface for us. So let's now create a controller for us to interface with our database and model. So back in our main folder again, let's create a new folder called controllers. And we'll just create a product controller. There we go. Yep, it'll be a class, and it will be an REST controller annotation and a request mapping /API products. Pretty generic. And then what we're going to do is we are going to be passing in, with the help of AutoWired, we're going to be passing in our product repository. Okay, and then we'll create a simple get mapping, which is just a basic /API /products, and it'll do a get all of our records in our database. So we'll be returning a list of product, and we'll just name the function get all, and we'll return product repository find all. Okay, now we just resolve all of these red lines. Easy peasy. Okay, now we take one short trip to our pom.xml file. Okay, so let's open up our pom.xml file and let's go down. It doesn't really matter where. I usually try and keep all the Spring Boot starter package dependency declarations sort of in the main section, but really it doesn't matter as long as it's somewhere within this dependencies group in our pom.xml file. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding make sure it's always there. We're just going to be adding one dependency for Spring Boot Docker Compose. So I'll add it right here, and I will try to highlight it with my editing software. So what we're going to be doing is creating a new dependency declaration of a group ID of org.springframework.boot and an artifact ID of Spring Boot Docker Compose. It's not yet built into the interface at start.spring.io, but this is a simple addition to your project, and just let VS Code or whatever editor you're using go ahead and pick that up and slurp it into your local Spring Boot dependencies. And now in the root of our folder, let's go ahead and create a Docker Compose file. That's kind of the point of this video. So let's create a docker compose.yaml. And then we're just going to be using version 3.1 actually. I think as long as it's version 3 or higher, you should be good to go. So if you haven't worked with YAML files before, they are tab-based and they are very specific about their usages of tabs. So just make sure that if you're cutting and pasting this YAML file into your own project, just make sure it's preserving all of the tabs and spacing so that it's properly picked up. Okay, so we've got a services section, and we're going to be creating two services. One is going to be our database, and this is the MariaDB database. And then one is going to be for PHPMyAdmin, and this will be for the just a tool, a GUI tool that will run within the container that we can use to inspect our database and have fun with it. And just make sure that the data is showing up in there that we expect. And then we're going to be creating one single volume, and this will be where our database will be storing, making use of some space to store what we're doing. And we'll just declare it dbData, : and then finally, we're going to be creating a single network called, I'm just calling it Spring Network, and a driver bridge declaration. Okay, so let's go back into our database service and make sure our spacing works out there. And so we are going to be using, for an image, we are going to be using the MariaDB 10.6.4 focal image. And for our restart parameter, we'll just restart it unless it's been stopped. Or you can use restart always. I don't think it really matters. The Docker GUI is pretty good at controlling your Docker containers and images when required. For ports, we need to expose a few ports here. So, well, just one actually. So our 3306 port from Maria will be mapped externally and internally to 3306 as well. If you haven't used MariaDB before, I should have mentioned before that it is a fork. At one time, it was a fork of the MySQL community project. Back when, now I'm going to get my history wrong, but it is essentially a fork of MySQL, and it allows you to basically use the same environment variables and syntax as MySQL. It should be more than compatible. In fact, if you use WordPress, if you're a WordPress developer, then the WordPress documentation for creating a local Docker file mentions making use of the MariaDB over MySQL, just due to compatibilities between ARM64 and AMD 64. Okay, all that blurbage aside. So we've got our ports set up. Now we're going to do we're going to be creating an environment file, which we'll go over in just a quick second here. And this will contain sort of our username and passwords for the database, which we never ever want to store in Git or any source control, not just Git. But you want to make sure that it is ignored using the git ignore file. And that way, when you commit this project to your repository, it doesn't have any hard-coded passwords basically throughout the app. And then we can also add an environment section, and I'll be able to show you what's going on as we create the environment file. Okay, so we've got a MySQL root password environment variable, and we are going to be using the MySQL root password, which will pull out of the end file. And then we'll have a MySQL database property, and this will be referencing the MySQL database environment variable. And then we'll have a MySQL user property, which is referencing the MySQL user, and a MySQL password environment variable, which is referencing the MySQL password environment variable. Okay, that's pretty much all we need, and then we just need to declare what volumes we're making use of, which will be our db data, and we'll shove it into the /var/lib/mysql mapping there, and then we'll make use of the Spring network. Okay, and that's all we need for our database. So let's turn our attention to PHPMyAdmin, and we are going to say that it depends on the database service. And then for an image, we're going to be using PHPMyAdmin/PHPMyAdmin. Pretty simple. Restart, the same key unless stopped. Ports, and this is going to be the external port that we use, which references the internal port in the container. So for example, I want to put this listening on port 8081 externally, so basically on anything making use of this Docker container, and then within the Docker container, it will be making use of the port 80. And then again, we're not referencing anything, or again, we're going to be making use of the end file key to our environment file. And then we're going to have another list of environment properties here. PMA host of our database service, and then our MySQL root password, which is going to be our MySQL root password environment variable. And again, our networks are going to be making use of the Spring network. And that's really all we need. We don't need much for the Docker Compose for this little sample app, but it's a great place to get started in playing with Docker and defining some local containerized images and services that we can make use of. Because of the Spring Boot Docker Compose dependency, it is now hooked directly into the Spring Boot server. So if we remember, I don't have the Docker Compose service running. I'm doing that on purpose. And if we go back into our Spring Boot dashboard extension here, and we try to start up a service, let's see what we get when we start it up. Okay, so as you can see here, we've got an error during connect. This error may indicate that the Docker daemon is not running. So just make sure that you've got your Docker service started. Let's go ahead and start ours up. Whatever platform you're running on, Mac or Linux, just make sure you've got your Docker container up and running. And I just want to make sure that I don't have any images, any containers, nothing that's predefined locally. Okay, so it's all empty. All right. We have to go back into our application.properties file, and we just need to make sure that we make use of the springboot.jpa.generate ddl equals true. And this will help Hibernate as well as Spring Boot generate the necessary tables for us. And this is all we should need to define. Oh, and we forgot to define our environment file. So let's go ahead in the root drive here, and let's go ahead and create a .env file that we referenced in our Docker Compose file. And then we've just got to add some entries here. So MySQL database, we'll just call it Spring Data. You can call it data, whatever you want. MySQL user, we're just going to call it Spring user. And for MySQL underscore password, we're going to use Spring underscore password. Again, just use values, whatever you want to use. You'll need them later when we log into PHPMyAdmin. But really, it doesn't matter what you put here as long as it's consistent. And for a MySQL root password, I'm just going to use root password. Nice and safe and secure, totally generic. Okay, so we've got things defined. We've got our environment variables set up. We've got our application properties key set up there. We've got our Docker service running, and we've got the Docker Compose Spring Boot dependency. So let's go back into the Spring Boot dashboard and get things started. And let's take a look at our log output. And it might be hard to see in this video, but it is going through the process of downloading the database and PHPMyAdmin images, which it finds on the Docker Hub. And then it will go through the process of putting those together based on our properties. Okay, so we've got a demo database healthy and a PHPMyAdmin healthy response. And then now it's going through the Spring Boot actual startup. Okay, and we can see that Tomcat is listening on port 8080. So everything looks like it's up and running. And let's go ahead and go into back in our browser, and let's go to localhost 8080 API products. Okay, and we get an empty array, which is what we're expecting because we have no data in the database. So now let's go into our PHPMyAdmin console. So HTTP localhost port 8081, and we've got a login now. Let's just expand this a little bit. So our username is our MySQL user, which was Spring user, and then our password was the MySQL_password key, which ended up being Spring_password. Let's log in, and you can see here we've got our Spring data database with our product table. And notice how we have our product table and our product sequence, which Hibernate generated for us when Spring Boot started up. Okay, so if we click into the product table, and remember it's totally empty. So let's go ahead and add a simple product for us. So click on the SQL tab, and I don't think I have anything saved. This is the first time I've started it. Okay, maybe that's a default message. Okay, so we're gonna insert into product, and we need to insert with the ID, description, name, and price columns. Notice how they're listed over here just for easy reference. And we're going to be using values of the next value for product sequence, which is a little bit SQL specific for MariaDB, but I believe in MySQL it is just the product sequence dot next val, something like that. It's a really quick Google if you're using a different database. So all we're doing is pulling the next sequence from that product sequence okay, and then for a description, let's just call this I don't know, description of product 1. And then our name will just be product 1, and our price, let's go for $9.99. And then we'll end that with semicolon, and we'll hit the go button, and it should insert it into the database. And there we go. One row inserted. So let's go back to the Browse tab, and we can see that we've got it right here. An ID of 1, description of product 1, an ID of 1, description of product 1 for $9.99. So let's go back to our web service tab. Let's refresh, and we should now see our product 1, which means that we are successfully internally communicating between the Spring Boot server and the database, as well as externally from our local browser environment. That's really about it for this video. That's all I wanted to show you. I think this is a really cool feature that the Spring Boot team has added into the Spring Boot core. I'm sure a lot of people will make use of it, and it'll be easier than ever to get a Docker containers up and running locally, or if you're deploying this to a server, for getting things up and running for your Spring Boot application. That's it for today's episode. I hope you really enjoyed what we went through. If you liked what you saw, just give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more notifications on other videos that we'll be doing in the future. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Have a good one. Peace.